Granby, Colorado was the kind of town people moved to in order to disappear peacefully. Tucked between mountains and sky, it was small enough that strangers stood out and familiar faces didn't need introductions. People waved, businesses closed early, disagreements were settled with long conversations, not lawyers. On paper, Granby was safe. On June 4, 2004, that illusion was annihilated by a man who lived among them, waved back, paid taxes, and smiled at neighbors while secretly preparing for war. This is the story of how a quiet welder named Marvin Heemeyer decided that if the town wouldn't listen to him, it would pay attention by force. Marvin Heemeyer didn't look dangerous. He wasn't loud. He wasn't violent, at least not outwardly. He ran a small muffler repair shop and lived a solitary life. To most people in Granby, Marvin was forgettable. That was his camouflage. But beneath the surface was a man who believed deeply, obsessively, that he had been wronged, and worse, that the system meant to protect him had instead conspired against him. That belief would become the fuse. The conflict that consumed Marvin's life didn't begin with rage. It began with zoning. In the late 1990s, Granby approved plans for a concrete plant near Marvin's property. Marvin opposed it fiercely, believing it would block access to his business and destroy its value. He filed complaints, he attended meetings, he argued his case, and then he lost. The town council approved the project anyway. To Granby, it was a routine development decision. To Marvin Heemeyer, it was proof of betrayal. People close to Marvin noticed a change. He stopped seeing the issue as a dispute and began seeing it as a war of good versus evil. He recorded himself ranting about corruption, injustice, and divine purpose. In one recording, he said, "Sometimes reasonable men must do unreasonable things." At the time, no one heard it. That sentence would later echo like a warning no one knew they needed. Marvin had legal avenues. He had compensation offers, some generous. He rejected them all. Because this was no longer about money or access, it was about control, about dignity, about winning. And when Marvin realized he could not win through paperwork, he began planning something far more final. Hidden inside Marvin's shop was a Komatsu D355A bulldozer, a machine meant for earth moving, not destruction. Over months, Marvin transformed it. Steel plating layered over every vulnerable point. Bulletproof panels sealed the cab. Cameras fed video to internal monitors, because once sealed inside, he would be blind. He added gun ports, reinforced the engine, created something no police force had ever trained for. This wasn't vandalism. This was engineering. The town noticed nothing. No alarms, no inspections, no concern. The shop doors stayed closed. The sounds were dismissed as welding work. Marvin waved to neighbors. He paid bills. He smiled. And beneath that smile, he was building a tank. On the morning of June 4, 2004, Marvin recorded a final message. He spoke calmly. There was no panic in his voice, only certainty. He sealed himself inside the armored bulldozer, knowing there was no way out once it closed. This was not a threat. This was a farewell. At approximately 3:15 p.m., Marvin drove the Killdozer through the wall of his own shop. The sound was thunderous, and with that single act, a quiet Colorado town became a battlefield. People screamed, cars swerved, police radios exploded with confusion. Bullets bounced harmlessly off steel. There was no way to communicate with the driver. There was no way to stop him. And as the armored machine rolled forward, one terrifying truth became clear. This was personal. Because Marvin Heemeyer didn't snap in a moment. He planned, he justified, he waited. And that means the danger wasn't chaos, it was conviction. The first building to fall wasn't a government office, it was his own. When Marvin Heemeyer drove the armored bulldozer through the wall of his muffler shop, witnesses would later say it felt unreal, like a movie set collapsing in slow motion. Concrete exploded outward, steel groaned, dust clouded the afternoon sky. It was the point of no return. From that moment on, Marvin was no longer a disgruntled mechanic. He was an unstoppable force moving through a town that had no defenses. At first, people didn't run, they stared. A massive bulldozer, encased in steel, rolled into the street where pickup trucks and sedans had been parked moments earlier. Some thought it was an accident, others believed it was a construction mishap. Then the machine turned and aimed. Marvin did not wander, he navigated. He drove straight toward buildings connected, directly or symbolically, to the zoning decision he believed had ruined his life. Town Hall, the former mayor's office, the local newspaper, businesses he believed had sided against him. This wasn't a tantrum, it was a list. The first police units to arrive were armed for a standoff, not a tank. Officers fired. Bullets sparked harmlessly off steel plating. Rifle rounds failed. Shotguns failed. Patrol cars were crushed like toys when they got too close. There was no visible driver, no window, no way to communicate. For the first time in modern American policing, officers faced a weaponized construction vehicle built specifically to defeat them. As the Killdozer advanced, sirens wailed and loudspeakers screamed warnings. "Get out! Evacuate immediately!" People fled through back doors, smashed windows and fire exits. Some escaped with seconds to spare, running as walls collapsed behind them. Inside one building, employees climbed into ceiling crawl spaces as the floor buckled below. The fact that no civilians were killed would later be called a miracle. In the moment, it felt like luck running out. The bulldozer's armor was layered with steel and concrete, thick enough to stop high-caliber rounds. The cab was sealed, ventilation was internal, cameras relayed outside images to screens inside. Marvin had anticipated tear gas, he had anticipated bullets, he had anticipated resistance. What he hadn't anticipated was how long it would take before anyone could even slow him down. As Granby descended into chaos, authorities considered extreme options: explosives, heavy weapons, air support. But every option carried a terrifying risk. If they detonated the vehicle near buildings, people could die. If they pierced the armor, the machine could lurch unpredictably. They had to let him move, and every second he moved, the town lost another piece of itself. After nearly 2 hours of destruction, the Killdozer entered a hardware store. The floor beneath it wasn't designed to support that weight. As the bulldozer rolled forward, the concrete cracked and the machine dropped into a basement. For the first time that day, Marvin was stuck. Inside the armored cab, Marvin knew what the police still couldn't see. There was no escape hatch, no plan B. He had designed the machine as a one-way door. As officers moved closer, still unable to breach the armor, Marvin ended the rampage himself. A single gunshot echoed from inside the steel shell. The war was over. The bulldozer sat motionless. Smoke drifted. Granby stood stunned. In less than 3 hours, 13 buildings were destroyed, millions of dollars in damage were done, and a quiet town had been scarred forever. Yet somehow, against every expectation, no civilians had died. After the dust settled and the steel finally cooled, the question that haunted investigators wasn't how Marvin Heemeyer did it, it was why. Because what he left behind wasn't just wreckage, it was a philosophy, carefully recorded and disturbingly calm. In the days following the rampage, authorities recovered audio recordings Marvin had made before sealing himself inside the Killdozer. They weren't frantic, they weren't emotional, they were methodical. Marvin spoke as if documenting a project, explaining his reasoning, his grievances, and his belief that he had been chosen to act when institutions failed. He described town officials as corrupt. He framed zoning decisions as personal attacks. He spoke of divine alignment, not divine mercy. This wasn't rage, it was moral certainty. Psychologists who later analyzed the recordings noticed a pattern. Marvin had fused his sense of self with the conflict. Losing the zoning battle didn't just inconvenience him, it erased his identity as a fair man in a fair system. Every compromise felt like betrayal. Every no felt like proof of conspiracy. At some point, the dispute stopped being external. It moved inside him. Marvin often said he had no other option, but records showed he had options: financial settlements, alternate access routes, legal appeals. He rejected them all, because accepting compromise would mean accepting defeat, and defeat, in his mind, meant annihilation of dignity. That logic is what makes cases like this so dangerous. When someone believes violence is the last reasonable act, they stop seeing themselves as a criminal and start seeing themselves as a correction. As news spread, something unsettling happened. Online forums lit up with admiration. People called Marvin a folk hero, a man who stood up to corruption, a symbol of resistance. They ignored the terror, they minimized the risk, they reframed destruction as righteousness. This mythology would outlive the facts. Because Marvin didn't target random civilians, because no one died except him, because people like clean narratives, and Marvin's story could be edited into one. But real justice doesn't come from selective memory. It comes from context. It erases the families who ran for their lives. It erases the officers who faced an impossible threat. It erases the employees trapped in collapsing buildings. It erases the reality that luck, not restraint, prevented mass casualties. The myth turns survival into intention, and that's dangerous. Listening to Marvin's tapes in full, not the clipped quotes shared online, reveals something colder. He did not speak of reconciliation. He did not express doubt. He spoke of inevitability, of destiny, of a world that forced his hand. That framing absolved him in his own mind, and that absolution made violence feel justified. Marvin's story is not unique in structure. It follows a familiar arc seen in extremist violence. 1. Personal grievance. 2. Perceived institutional betrayal. 3. Isolation. 4. Moral reframing. 5. Action presented as necessity. The difference here was the weapon and the scale. After the rampage, Granby didn't just rebuild buildings, it rebuilt trust. Neighbors questioned what they missed. Officials re-examined how disputes are handled. Police nationwide rewrote playbooks for armored threats. But no training manual can fully prepare for someone who plans in silence. When the steel finally went quiet and the smoke drifted away, Granby didn't feel victorious. It felt exposed. The town had survived a siege without losing a civilian life, but survival,
everyone would soon learn, was not the same thing as recovery. Buildings could be rebuilt, roads repaved, windows replaced, but certainty, the belief that conflict ends at the courthouse door, was gone. Authorities dismantled the Killdozer piece by piece. Steel plates were cut away, cameras removed. The reinforced cab opened to daylight for the first time since Marvin sealed himself inside. Inside, they found meticulous preparation, tools neatly arranged, monitors positioned for constant visibility, no exit. It confirmed what investigators had already suspected. This was never meant to end in surrender. The machine was destroyed, its remains scattered to prevent relic making, but the story escaped containment. Granby rebuilt with restraint. There were no statues, no plaques celebrating survival. Officials avoided spectacle. The goal was normalization, not myth-making. Businesses reopened, streets filled again. Children played where walls once fell, but residents spoke in lower voices when they passed certain lots. Trauma doesn't shout, it whispers. Across the country, police departments studied Granby's after-action reports. Training modules were rewritten. New questions entered briefings. What if the threat is armored? What if negotiation is impossible? What if stopping the machine risks the people behind it? Specialized equipment followed. So did protocols that emphasized evacuation and containment over confrontation. Granby became a case study, not for what went wrong, but for what had never been anticipated. Online, the narrative fractured. Some told the story as a warning about grievance and escalation. Others told it as a parable of rebellion. Short clips stripped of context circulated, quotes without timelines, images without aftermath. The terror was edited out. The luck, no civilian deaths, was recast as intention. This wasn't analysis, it was myth-making, because myths simplify. They turn complex harm into slogans. They excuse destruction by reframing it as courage. They teach the wrong lesson to the wrong people. The truth is harder and more important. Marvin Heemeyer did not expose corruption through destruction. He demonstrated how unchecked grievance can radicalize in isolation. The town didn't deserve what happened, and survival did not mean consent. Granby learned that disputes don't need volume to become dangerous, only fixation. That grievance, when fed long enough, can become identity. That identity, when threatened, can become violence. And that community safety depends as much on listening early as it does on responding late. No civilians died that day, an outcome owed more to evacuation and chance than restraint. 13 buildings were destroyed, millions were lost. A town's sense of safety was permanently altered. Marvin Heemeyer died believing he had proven something. History remains undecided, not because the facts are unclear, but because interpretation is contested. And that may be the most unsettling legacy of all. Does the absence of civilian deaths change how this act should be judged? Where is the line between grievance and radicalization? How should communities intervene when disputes become obsession? Why do some acts of violence become myths while others are condemned outright? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. If this story challenged how you think about grievance, justice, and violence, like this video, subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes, turn on notifications for the next investigation. Before you leave, the Killdozer wasn't the only time a personal grievance turned public and deadly. In our next episode, a routine court appearance becomes a massacre, and the warning signs were visible long before the first shot. Watch the next video on your screen now.